Teppen's foundation has generally stayed the same since the game came out almost a year ago, but we have seen some significant changes that come with each expansion. And that got me thinking recently, what was the high point of this game? Which expansion out of the 5 we have so far, not counting the new one that's on the way, which of those 5 is the best? So we're going to rank them from best to worst. Let's get into it. First, let me establish some criteria before we get into this list. This is based on my opinion, and I'm not proclaiming my opinions as fact. I never do. This is just based on my experience from having played the game at a champion level since it came out. And I'm factoring in a couple of different things that I'll elaborate on as we go through this list. And most importantly, for any and all disagreements or agreements, be sure to drop those in the comments below. I love to get into those TEPPEN discussions in the comments with you guys, so let's make sure we kickstart one of those with this video. Coming in at the bottom of the barrel, number 5, this probably won't surprise you, but that is Haunted by Memories. Yes, Zero from Mega Man is a hype machine, and a lot of people were really excited when he got teased and then later announced. However, this expansion, in my opinion, is definitely Teppen's low point. I'm not going to drag into a huge discussion about why that is, because I basically did an entire video talking about it. But more to the point, memory is a big problem in terms of the mechanic. Memory is that little invisible stack that you create for every action that you play, and certain cards get better benefits when you have a higher memory count. And memory is pretty easy to raise for a lot of decks, and that leads to a meta where there's not a ton of unit interaction between decks and players, and that's something that I really liked about Teppen's Foundation when it came out. That kind of plays into the real-time card game aspect that becomes less of a factor when there are less units being played, especially ones that don't have as much consequence. That's kind of led to what I definitely would consider a somewhat diverse meta, but one that kind of relies a lot on heavy RNG and crazy top decks to kind of get mileage. The obvious really good ones are the Rakoha builds for Zero that rely on building up memory for the big finish with Ceasefire and X Hunters. Those variants are really powerful. Denjin Renki Ryu relying on tons of easy access to burn damage, not just straight to your opponent, but also to the units on the board. There's a few other decks there. Nero has certainly become a lot more popular recently, and people are experimenting with a lot of other things, mainly out of boredom. So there are decks out there, but I think the top tiers have been solidified for quite a long time, and I think that just kind of gives an overall impression that this meta is, it's kind of stale. You know, decks relying on a lot of RNG kind of take away the player skill aspect. You feel less like you're in control. And of all the metas that this game has been in, I think Haunted by Memories is definitely the worst when it comes to this aspect. It did add a lot of really cool things. There's a lot of really great cards in here that I like. And of course, as always with Teppen, the artwork is absolutely on point. But this is by far the most unexciting meta to me. Coming in at number 4 is the Force Seekers. This is the one that we got in early January paired with Akuma that was teased at the Teppen World Finals in December. There was a lot of hype going into this. Akuma's a very hyped character who doesn't love Goki, and it teased a new mechanic called Ascension, which is just another way for you to play a unit on top of a unit you already have, and it gets boosted stats. This on paper was fantastic for one aspect and kind of a detriment for another. So let's start with the boon, the benefit. One thing that was really cool was this allowed you to prevent locking yourself on your board. Now, what do I mean by that? There were certain situations where decks kind of got themselves into a position where you were locked into the 3 units that you played, and certain decks could just kind of ignore what you were playing and go towards their own win condition. And if you were board locked, there wasn't really anything you could do outside of actions. So if you had 3 units that weren't really doing anything anything on the board, a handful of units, and your opponent is ignoring them, what can you really do? It's essentially solitaire at this point. So Ascension was a solution to that, and when a lot of people read that, that was kind of the idea that they had in mind. This is going to allow for a lot of really cool ways of play. It's going to allow TEPPEN to become more diverse. It's kind of another layer on top of that foundation. But a lot of people also noticed something else, and that is the prevalence of Yawn. And this was talked about before this expansion even came out, just when we knew what Ascension was. For those of you who are not familiar, Yawn is a Chun-Li hero art, and at the time, it only costs 15 AP to put a little status effect on a unit of your choosing. And when that unit dies or leaves the board for whatever reason, you gain bonus MP. It was really easy to trigger, and a lot of people in that kind of frame of mind before the Force Seekers came out were kind of sleeping on the strength of this deck. It was already really good, and a lot of people said Ascension is going to make this busted if they don't adjust it, and they didn't. They didn't adjust it until March, when there was sweeping balance changes kind of across the board to a few things, which was kind of too little too late. So what that resulted in was a meta that kind of revolved around Yawn. And I realize this happens for a lot of card games. The tiers beneath the top tier are kind of built upon what can hang in the face of this deck. And Yawn was dominant. Yawn was the big deck that a lot of people were choosing to climb with. So what did people do in response? They tried to figure out what worked against it. And that brought along the prevalence of mono black, and in Wesker, which did have a decent matchup against it. Unfortunately, that kind of really led to those two decks being the big picks there for a while, and the other decks not really seeing a whole lot of other play. Now, there were some aggressive flight-based and halt-based dual-color aggressive decks that a lot of people didn't really like, but I think they're quite fun to play, that were kind of hanging in the wings. Ryu was still there, and Ryu's kind of always been there because he's a high-skill character that somebody with really good reaction times can generally always get really good results. And he got some extra stuff from this expansion as well. So purple became less prevalent here because there were some subtle nerfs to what made them so good. But that kind of puts the Force Seekers in number 4 on this list. A lot of people were down on this expansion, especially towards the tail end of it. People were really, really hungry for some change. There was a lot of cries about Yawn needing to be balanced, so people were grateful for that. But because there wasn't a lot of deck diversity here, this one is number 4 for me. Number 3 on the list, we're kind of going in reverse order of release here so far, and that is The Devil's Awaken. There was a ton of hype for this expansion because this was coming from the point where I would argue the most people were playing TEPPEN. It was a Devil May Cry focused expansion. Nero was coming out, who is a fan favorite. Everybody loves Devil May Cry, and that's what we were getting. And we got a really cool mechanic in the form of growth, which is just essentially a way for a unit to level up the more units that you play on the board. The thing about growth is a lot of people had a lot of hype around it early on, and initially when the previews for Nero's Hero Arts came out, a lot of people thought he was going to be ridiculous. And what ended up happening is he kind of ended up being middle of the road, and growth wasn't nearly as crazy as our initial impressions led us to believe. This meta was actually pretty diverse for a little bit. There was a lot of green. Green really got some things that it needed, but at the end of the day, green was still kind of really slow. And up until this point, green had kind of been it's the color you splash in dual color decks because of the utility, like the shields, the seals, and the MP boost, which you could get in under 5 MP. Red was still pretty popular, black, and then the purple ended up being the most popular color here. If you remember watching the TEPPEN World Finals, you remember there was a little bit of Chun-Li, a little bit of Ryu, a lot of Wesker, and a ton of Resonate. A lot of people were really, really hating on Resonate at this point in time. The finals actually ended up being a mirror match of 4 Resonate decks. The Fudge Resonate meme is kind of where that got started. All in all, this expansion was a lot of fun. I played a lot during the Devil's Awaken, and it kind of led into Teppen's biggest live event ever, which ended up having quite a few people viewing it when it was happening in Japan. There was a lot of hype around this. People were picking their favorite players. Everybody had someone to root for, and that was a lot of fun. So I hope that we get to replicate that experience sometime soon. Number 2 on my Teppen's expansion rank list is the core card pack. Yes, this is where Teppen started, the first piece of content that we ever got. The way that it worked was in July, there were 2 distinctive areas of cards. There were the basic cards that everybody got access to, and then there were the core cards, which you got through packs. That was the only expansion we had at the time, and in all honesty, it was pretty good. A lot of these cards focused on heavy unit interaction, but if you pay close attention, a lot of what's in core is still played today. There's a lot of utility in there in forms of cheap shields, seals, other things of that nature. Purple cards that are super prevalent like Foresight, which are still around, even some red staples that still see play. Core is not bad. Now, a lot of people think that the biggest attracting point for core was kind of the original situation with Nergigante's spike launch. If you weren't playing the game back in the day, the way that worked is that spike launch had no cap on its damage. Basically, you could sacrifice as much life as you wanted to, and if it went beyond 12, then you were dealing spike launches for upwards of like 20 damage in some situations. It was a bit excessive, and spike launch was actually a little bit cheaper in the AP cost than it is today, and a lot of people were upset. There was an invitational tournament that happened early on, and there was a lot of spike launch, a lot of Ryu, a lot of purple, but people were really down on spike launch, but it did get an emergency adjustment, and the balance change was actually really good. And after that balance change, I think it was a really solid expansion that was actually pretty diverse, and required you to have, a lot of skill and knowledge in terms of how you're playing things. It was less action heavy with the exception of Resonate, but Resonate wasn't this runaway deck type that it really became to be in the Devil's Awaken. It was hard countered by Ryu and red decks in a lot of situations, and the meta was pretty diverse because it was still developing. Wesker was good at this point. Nergigante, we've already talked about. Ryu, Rathalos was starting to become more popular, although he didn't really hit his stride until the next expansion we're going to talk about. There was a lot going on, and core has a lot to love. Now, some people think that it's time for core to rotate out to really diversify this game's meta, and I wouldn't mind seeing that. There's a lot of cards in core that are still played that I think would change the dynamic of the game quite a bit, which would be really refreshing. But the state of core when we were in July moving into September, that was a really sweet time to get into Teppen, and the foundation of the game is what attracted so many people to begin with. Core is so good that in fact it is only trumped by one other expansion in the game's history. Number 1 on my Teppen expansion tier list, that has to be Day of Nightmares. This was the very first expansion we ever got. This is where we got Jill Valentine from the Resident Evil series, and we got the new Explore mechanic, which allows you to grab extra cards to your EX pockets depending on what you're doing throughout the course of the game. Day of Nightmares, in my opinion, was a very skill-based expansion, but the thing about it was actually really diverse. Some people gravitate to the Wrath Awoken red-green builds that were building up pretty ridiculous flyers to swing for insane amounts of damage, but it wasn't the end-all be-all. The Fours deck, this is where this first started to pop up, specifically for Morgan, more so than with Dante, but that deck kind of had a lot of control-y elements to it, but you had to play it very carefully and correctly. Ryu was still popular at this point. Jill was kind of in a mid-tier. She kind of came in I would argue a little bit underwhelming, but sort of evened out as people began to gravitate towards antibody activation, having unit heavy decks and being able to drop those shields cheaply as long as you hit that Explorer threshold really began to catch on. Nergigante, Wesker were still popular. Green was being played, but it was still kind of the dual color sort of situation where people were shoehorning it in for utility. Green didn't really get a whole lot of fun, neat tools in this expansion. There were some cool things, but nothing that could really dictate an entire deck. But this expansion was fantastic. I played so much TEPPEN when the Day of Nightmares expansion was out. This is actually when we broke the 4 million player mark, I believe. I'm fairly certain of that, but if I'm wrong, feel free to drop some knowledge in the comments. But I loved this expansion. Explorer was a new, neat mechanic, but it wasn't incredibly dominant like what Ascension and Memory came to be. It had a nice little fit in with everything else that we had. There were a lot of neat changes to the foundation of the game, but you know, the core, you know, philosophy, at least in my mind, as to what TEPPEN is supposed to be, didn't really change all that much. It was a great extra layer on top of that foundation, and I really missed this expansion a lot. A lot of those decks were really fun, and I'm actually going to link up top right above my head to a little tier list video I did when Day of Nightmares was out to kind of give you some perspective on the state of the game when that was out. And I can't help but smile because I've got a lot of fond memories for Day of Nightmares. So as far as expansion goes, so far, Day of Nightmares is my favorite TEPPEN expansion, #1 on my list. So what's your #1? When was TEPPEN at its high point? Be sure to let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to let me know that you want more TEPPEN content. And because we have a new Monster Hunter expansion on the way in July, there's going to be plenty of new juicy stuff to talk about. I guarantee it. Take care of yourselves. I love you guys, and I'll see you next time.